July 7th, 1944. The island of Saipan lay in darkness before dawn, a landscape of coral dust and mangled trees. In the shallow trenches near the village of Tanapag, men of the U.S. 105th Infantry Regiment tried to sleep beside their rifles. The air smelled of salt, blood, and cordite. Somewhere out in the blackness, the sea whispered against the reef. Then came the sound, low at first, like distant surf. The first to hear it was a radio operator. He froze, headset pressed to his ear. The sound was not the ocean. It was voices, hundreds, then thousands, chanting in rhythm. The jungle ahead began to tremble. From the darkness came the metallic clatter of bayonets fixed to rifles, the hollow boom of drums, the cry of men who had chosen death over surrender. Flares hissed upward, turning night into a frozen photograph. The light revealed a wall of figures surging through smoke. Japanese soldiers, many without helmets, some barefoot, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. Officers waved swords above their heads, shouting as they ran. It was a Banzai charge, the largest of the Pacific War. 13,000 men advancing in a single wave. Machine guns opened fire. The first ranks fell, but the rest kept coming, climbing over the dead, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Grenades burst among them, yet the momentum did not break. From every foxhole came the same stunned whisper. "They're still coming." The roar was overwhelming. Bugles, explosions, screams, the chopping rhythm of Brownings firing until the barrels glowed red. American artillery joined in, saturating the field with shells that ripped the charge apart. Shards of coral and bodies flew into the air. The ground shook as the line held. Still they came, tripping, crawling, charging into the flames. By dawn, the noise had faded. The men of the 105th climbed from their foxholes into a mist that smelled of metal and smoke. Before them lay a field covered in silence. Thousands of fallen soldiers, the largest mass suicide attack of the war. One private wrote later, "They were brave beyond belief, but the bravery had nowhere to go." The sun rose over Saipan, red and indifferent. Around the shattered palm trees, the rifles still pointed outward, as if the battle might start again. But it was over. The empire that had taught its sons that death was duty had met an enemy whose faith was not in courage, but in calculation. At the start of the Pacific War, every American soldier heard the same warning: you can't fight people who aren't afraid to die. Reports from the Philippines and Guadalcanal told of Japanese troops charging machine guns, leaping into trenches with grenades pressed to their chests. The press called them fanatics, human waves, ghosts with rifles. In the barracks and on the ships, men whispered that bullets couldn't stop such madness. The myth began inside Japan itself. From childhood, soldiers were taught that surrender was shame, that the emperor's service demanded a death as pure as polished glass. Military manuals spoke of yokusai, honorable annihilation, the noble shattering of one's life for the nation. Officers drilled into recruits that to survive capture was to stain their families forever. Fear was erased, replaced by ritual. When those men reached the islands, that belief made them terrible opponents. On Guadalcanal, they charged American positions at night, screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor," until they were cut down by machine guns. On Tarawa, they fought until nothing moved. The sight of such courage terrified the young Marines who faced it. Some swore they could feel the ground shake under their feet. The fear spread faster than the facts. Rumors claimed Japanese soldiers never surrendered, that they carried poisoned grenades for suicide. For a time, U.S. commanders believed the same, warning their men to expect no quarter. But the myth hid a weakness. The Banzai charge was not supernatural. It was a tactic born of desperation. As Japanese logistics collapsed, ammunition dwindled and communication failed. Commanders turned to spirit where supply had vanished. Faith replaced fuel. The enemy's ferocity was real, but its foundation was hollow. The Americans learned this slowly. At first they fired blindly, panicked, wasting rounds. Then they noticed patterns. The attacks came at night, always frontal, always without coordination. The same courage that once seemed unstoppable became predictable. Machine gunners began to wait. Artillery officers marked the approaches in advance. Fear turned into procedure. The myth of the invincible charge cracked under repetition. For every 1,000 men who ran forward, only a handful reached the lines. Courage alone could not outpace fire control. By 1944, the sentence, "You can't stop people who aren't afraid to die," had changed meaning. It no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like an equation. Those who sought death would find it. Those who organized survival would win. The Americans had learned the truth of modern war. Belief cannot outrun bullets, and courage cannot fill an empty magazine. To understand the Banzai charge, one must trace its anatomy, not through glory but through structure. It began not as madness but as doctrine. In the Meiji era, Japan's new army absorbed the samurai ethos into modern command. Death was not a possibility, but a purpose. Soldiers memorized codes that fused obedience with religion. To die in battle was to prove loyalty beyond the flesh. The emperor was divine. His soldiers were extensions of that divinity. By the 1930s, this belief had hardened into the foundation of Japan's military psychology. Victory was secondary to purity. The soldier's duty was not to win, but to die correctly. In the jungles of China and the islands of the Pacific, this translated into an obsession with attack. Japanese officers distrusted defense as cowardice. The preferred tactic was the gyokusai, the honorable death charge. In theory, the Banzai was meant to break enemy morale through shock, closing the distance before superior firepower could react. In practice, it became a ritual of annihilation. Coordination was minimal, artillery was scarce, radios often failed or were never issued. By 1944, most Japanese divisions in the Pacific had lost their heavy weapons and relied on rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Commanders ordered mass charges because there was nothing else left to command. The structure was brutal and simple. At the signal, a bugle, a shout, or the wave of a sword, lines of men surged forward, sometimes 1,000 at once. Officers led from the front, often carrying family swords instead of sidearms. Behind them came riflemen and laborers pressed into combat, armed with grenades or sharpened bamboo poles. There was no retreat, no regrouping, no logistics plan. The attack ended only when every participant was dead. For the Americans, the first encounters were horrifying. The noise, the speed, the certainty of death. It felt like facing a flood. But for the Japanese, these charges were the last visible expression of an empire already collapsing. Food was gone, ammunition nearly exhausted, reinforcements impossible. When radios went silent, spirit took their place. This was not strategy. It was substitution. Where the United States relied on procedures, grids, and pre-sighted artillery, Japan relied on myth. The result was tragedy measured in thousands. The soldiers who shouted Banzai believed they were fulfilling eternity. Their commanders knew they were expending bodies to delay the inevitable. In the Pacific, courage became currency, spent recklessly as resources vanished. Each charge was a receipt written in blood, a declaration that faith had replaced fuel, and that faith, alone, could not stop the geometry of American firepower. By the time of Saipan, the Banzai charge had become both weapon and suicide note. Its anatomy was simple. No communication, no retreat, no chance. Only men running toward the thunder, because the alternative, survival, was worse. The Banzai charge lived on faith. The United States fought on figures. One side trusted sacrifice, the other trusted supply. And in the Pacific, numbers ended illusions faster than bullets. A single U.S. rifle company on Saipan fielded 12 Browning machine guns, 3 60mm mortars, and 2 81mm tubes for support. Each gun team carried thousands of rounds stacked in boxes along the perimeter. Behind them waited the 105mm howitzers of the division artillery, their positions already plotted for defensive fire. Every approach to the American line had coordinates, range data, and firing tables ready. When a Banzai charge began, the system moved automatically. A forward observer called in a pre-sighted code, red dog, green apple, white 2. Within minutes, howitzers were dropping shells by the dozen. One 105-millimeter battery could fire 6,000 shells in an hour. Multiply that by 10 battalions on Saipan, and the math becomes merciless. 60,000 explosive arguments against honor. In one night on July 7th, 13,000 Japanese soldiers attacked. By dawn, 12,000 were dead. American losses were fewer than 700. The ratio was 20-1. Courage measured against chemistry, spirit erased by physics. At the height of the battle, the average American soldier carried over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Each M1 Garand could fire 8 aim shots in less than 5 seconds. A single platoon could unleash a wall of lead every minute. Multiply that across hundreds of rifles, and a Banzai charge, no matter how loud, how determined, met a hurricane of metal. It was not just firepower, it was method. The U.S. military fought by formula. Every foot of ground was registered for artillery, every approach mined or covered by intersecting fields of fire. When the bugles sounded and the Japanese broke from cover, the Americans did not panic. They adjusted sights, corrected ranges, and waited for the right moment. The Japanese army, starving and short of ammunition, had no such balance sheet. Their soldiers advanced with bayonets fixed because they had little left to shoot. The gap between the two forces could be measured in calories, in gallons of fuel, in tons of powder produced every week by American factories. The Banzai charge was bravery multiplied by zero logistics. Numbers hurt because they stripped away poetry. The math of the Pacific War revealed that courage, without coordination, becomes arithmetic. On Saipan, on Tinian, on Guam, the results were the same. Hundreds charging into thousands of bullets, the human wave shattered by the machine wave. The Americans didn't outshout the Banzai cry, they outcalculated it. In the ledgers of war, faith without fuel equals death, and precision without fear equals victory. The night before the charge, the men of the 105th Infantry Regiment dug in among the coral ridges of northern Saipan. Their lines curved like a scar through the cane fields, facing an enemy they could not see but could always hear. The island smelled of rot and salt. Somewhere in the dark, wounded men screamed in Japanese, voices echoing through broken palm trunks. The Americans knew something was coming. No one slept. Just before dawn, a faint hum rolled across the plain. It began as a vibration in the soil, then grew into thunder. The sound was not vehicles, it was feet, thousands of feet. The order went down the line. Stand to, load up. Men tightened their helmets, checked ammo belts, and waited. Flares arced overhead, lighting the battlefield in bursts of blue-white glare. What they saw defied belief. The open ground ahead was moving. Ranks of Japanese infantry, bayonets glinting, officers waving swords, voices rising in a single roar. They were charging through the artillery zone, shoulder to shoulder, shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" It was the largest frontal attack of the Pacific War. The first machine guns opened fire. Tracers streaked across the field, cutting the front ranks down like wheat. Still they came, climbing over bodies, some firing pistols, others swinging sabers. Grenades burst, men fell, and the wave kept surging. The Americans fired until the barrels smoked, swapping out guns, tossing ammo boxes down the line. "Hold your ground," someone shouted. "Keep firing!" When the pressure became unbearable, the Americans called in artillery on their own positions. Shells screamed overhead and landed just beyond the perimeter, tearing the charge apart in bursts of fire and sand. The concussion rolled through the foxholes. Men's ears bled from the shock waves. But the line held. Through the smoke, some Japanese soldiers reached the American positions. There were brief hand-to-hand fights, bayonets against entrenching tools, knives and rifle butts. The encounters were savage and quick. By the time the sun began to rise, the survivors were crawling, dragging themselves forward through a field already filled with the dead. By mid-morning, the noise had faded. The field in front of the 105th was a wasteland. Thousands of bodies twisted in the grass, rifles broken, flags half buried in the dirt. The Americans walked among them in silence, numb with exhaustion. A corporal wrote later, "They weren't men anymore. They were motion." 13,000 Japanese soldiers had gone forward. Nearly all were dead. The regiment counted its own losses, 650 men killed or wounded. The proportions felt impossible, obscene. The Americans did not cheer. They simply reloaded and rebuilt their defenses. One young lieutenant said quietly, "It wasn't bravery that saved us. It was procedure." The Banzai charge had been the Empire's last great scream, a collective act of defiance turned into arithmetic. The Americans had not stopped it with courage. They had stopped it with system, fire discipline, pre-sighted artillery, overlapping fields of fire, radios that worked, and supply lines that never broke. When the last echo of battle died, the island was silent except for the sound of waves breaking on coral. The men cleaned their rifles and wrote in their diaries. They would never forget the faces that came through the smoke, or the realization that courage alone could not overcome the machinery of order. On that day, faith met logistics, and logistics won. After Saipan, the Banzai charge was no longer a mystery. It became a formula, and once a formula is known, it can be solved. The Americans broke the code of terror with mathematics. They learned the intervals, the approach angles, the sound of the bugles that signaled an attack. Every night, defense was rehearsed like an orchestra, repeating the same piece until it became instinct. When Japanese troops massed for another assault, there was no panic. The officers issued short, practiced orders. Check sectors. Confirm illumination. Prepare counterfire. Soldiers adjusted tripods, tested triggers, laid out grenades in neat rows. Flares turned the jungle into daylight, and machine guns swept the clearing with measured precision. Every step of the enemy advance met a known response. The system was cold but perfect. Pre-sighted artillery zones were drawn into maps. When a charge began, radio calls triggered fire missions that fell within minutes. Infantry lines were staggered to prevent overlap and confusion. Mortar teams worked by stopwatch. What once felt like chaos became procedure. The Japanese attack still came with the same shouts, the same blind courage, but the effect had changed. Each new charge was swallowed by calculation, destroyed before it reached the lines. Officers stopped warning their men about fanatics. They simply said, "If they come, hold to the pattern." By the end of 1944, a Banzai charge no longer inspired fear. It triggered reflex. American troops spoke of it the way they might speak of a storm. Violent, brief, inevitable, and survivable. For the Japanese soldiers, the psychological shift was devastating. What had once been proof of honor now felt like waste. Entire battalions vanished in minutes, their courage answered not by enemy fear, but by artillery grids and ammunition logs. The war of spirit had met the war of spreadsheets. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The tactic that once promised transcendence now meant extermination. After Saipan, no Banzai charge would ever break an American perimeter again. The math was unarguable. Coordination divided by desperation equals survival. Fear, when disciplined into process, becomes power. The Americans had turned terror into timing and timing into victory. 2 years before Saipan, the lesson had begun in blood. Guadalcanal, 1942, the first major land battle of the Pacific. The Marines who landed there were young, tired, and half-starved, fighting for an airstrip they barely knew how to defend. Their trenches were shallow, their lines thin, their supply uncertain. What they faced in the nights that followed would shape the way the U.S. fought for the rest of the war. The Japanese called it the Night of the Crocodiles. The Americans called it hell. On August 21st, near the mouth of Alligator Creek, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 900 elite soldiers of the Imperial Army against a thin line of Marines guarding the sandbar. They advanced at night, confident that one charge would crush the enemy. The order was the same as always: fix bayonets, move fast, die gloriously. The Marines waited in the dark. Their machine guns were already positioned, arcs of fire marked in the sand with stakes. They had mines along the creek and mortars zeroed in on the opposite bank. When the Japanese shouted their first Banzai and surged forward, the air erupted. The first wave disintegrated under gunfire. Tracer rounds cut through the jungle, turning men into silhouettes that collapsed mid-run. Those behind them stumbled over the fallen, still shouting, still charging. The Marines fired until the barrels glowed. The creek turned black with blood. At dawn, the smoke cleared. Over 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead, many only yards from the Marine line. The Americans lost fewer than 50. For the first time, they realized something fundamental. The charge was not invincible. It was predictable. In the following weeks, the Marines began to map patterns. Every Japanese assault came at night, preceded by bugles, drums, or shouted orders. The men learned to stay calm. They rationed ammunition, waited for clear targets, and trusted the geometry of their defenses. Fear gave way to control. When another Banzai attack came a month later, the Marines met it with ruthless precision. Mortars fired by clock, machine gunners aimed by preset marks. They no longer saw monsters in the dark, only targets. The psychological shift was immense. The Japanese believed their charge would terrify. Instead, it trained the enemy to anticipate. Each repetition made the Americans colder, more efficient, less human in their reactions. Discipline replaced dread. A Marine sergeant wrote afterward, "They came like ghosts, but ghosts bleed. Once you know that, you stop fearing them." Guadalcanal was the first time the United States faced the Banzai charge in force, and the first time it understood the cost of courage without coordination. The men who survived those nights would carry the memory into every battle that followed. By the time Saipan arrived 2 years later, what had once been chaos was routine. The lessons of Alligator Creek had hardened into doctrine. The Americans no longer saw suicide charges. They saw opportunities to apply procedure. That was how the learning began. One night, one creek, one impossible storm of courage erased by the cold arithmetic of fire. By mid-1944, the Banzai charge had become a predictable tragedy. On the neighboring island of Tinian, only weeks after Saipan, the same pattern repeated with precision and futility. The Japanese garrison, short of ammunition and surrounded, gathered for one final assault. 3,000 men fixed bayonets and advanced through the cane fields in a single mass, shouting the Emperor's name. The Americans waited. They had spent nights preparing kill zones, overlapping arcs of fire, and pre-registered artillery points. When the bugles sounded, they switched on searchlights. The battlefield lit up as if daylight had returned. Machine guns cut through the ranks in clean lines. Mortars walked their explosions forward yard by yard. In less than an hour, the charge was over. 3,000 dead. Not one man reached the American line. After Tinian, the tactic began to vanish. The Japanese commanders still spoke of honor, but their soldiers had seen too much. They had watched comrades run into hurricanes of bullets and disappear. On Okinawa in 1945, only fragments of the old spirit remained. The defenders there did not charge. They hid. They dug into caves and tunnels, turning the island into a fortress of stone. The cries of Banzai were replaced by the silence of waiting. The shift was telling. The empire that had once glorified death now measured its survival in meters of soil. Courage was no longer enough. The Americans had adapted, and the Japanese were forced to follow. When the few remaining units attempted old-style attacks, they disintegrated before the first machine gun burst. The U.S. troops no longer even called them battles. They called them cleanups. On Okinawa, some officers tried to revive the old myth. They urged their men to die gloriously, to charge the invaders one last time. But starvation and exhaustion had eroded faith. Many soldiers ignored the order. Some took their own lives, others surrendered in silence, ashamed but alive. A U.S. private wrote home after the campaign, "They don't shout anymore. They just hide until we find them. It's like fighting ghosts that gave up screaming." The doctrine of the Banzai charge, once the empire's most dramatic symbol of courage, had become a memory, a suicide ritual no army could afford. Its death was not sudden but procedural, crushed beneath the weight of American logistics and repetition. Tinian and Okinawa closed the cycle that began at Guadalcanal. What started as terror became routine, then extinction. The Americans had built a system that neutralized faith. The Japanese, trapped by their own code, could only vanish within it. By war's end, the last Banzai cries were not battle commands but echoes from a vanished world. A sound swallowed by the hum of engines, the crack of rifles, and the steady rhythm of armies that measured victory not in courage, but in control. The Banzai charge was born as poetry and died as data. It began with a dream of noble death and ended beneath the weight of numbers no courage could surpass. By 1945, it was not a tactic but a memorial, a memory of faith colliding with fact. The idea that willpower could overcome machinery belonged to another century. Industrial war erased it. For the Americans who survived Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa, the image never faded. The waves of men running through tracer fire, the swords glinting in the light of flares, the sudden quiet when the noise stopped. They called it bravery, yes, but also futility. One Marine said, "They died exactly as they were told to, and that's why they lost." The empire that worshipped death could not compete with an enemy that worshipped process. The Banzai charge depended on obedience. American defense depended on integration. Each man, gun, and radio existed as part of a grid. When the charge began, that grid awakened, mechanical, indifferent, unstoppable. The old code of honor demanded self-destruction. The new code of survival demanded calibration. In that difference lay the future of warfare. A Japanese officer who surrendered on Tinian later said, "We were taught that death was stronger than fear, but their system had no fear to exploit." It was the clearest epitaph for the Banzai myth. The Americans had proven that the highest courage was not to die well, but to function well. On Saipan, a captured sword lay twisted over a machine gun barrel, the metal warped by heat. The sword had once symbolized the will to die. The gun symbolized the will to endure. When the two met, one melted. The Banzai charge ended not in dishonor, but in revelation. It showed the world that mass bravery without structure collapses under its own beauty. Courage, when divorced from logic, becomes a kind of suicide. In the arithmetic of war, spirit alone equals 0. Precision, multiplied by patience, equals survival. That was the lesson written across the Pacific, carved into the coral, and measured in the silence that followed every charge. When the war ended, the cries of Banzai faded from the world. The men who had shouted them were gone, and the few who survived returned to ruins that no longer believed in the promise of death. The Americans went home too, haunted by what they had seen. Some carried swords as souvenirs, others carried nightmares of voices charging through the dark. But all of them carried the same lesson. Courage without coordination dies quickly, and procedure without fear endures. The Pacific taught that modern war is not a contest of hearts, but of systems. The side that masters repetition, supply, and precision will always outlast the side that relies on passion alone. The Banzai charge was the last song of a pre-industrial army facing the rhythm of the modern age, and the music ended in fire.